Hello and welcome to the very first UNESCO Idries Shah Foundation joint webinar on the power of stories. We've got an absolutely wonderful panel here today. We have psychologists, we have scientists, we have writers and poets, we have therapists, and above all, we have storytellers. And we're very lucky to have with us today Gabriela Ramos, the Assistant Director, Social and Human Science of UNESCO, to officially open our webinar. Thank you so much, Gabriela.
Saira, I am the one that needs to thank you, because this is just so refreshing. Listening first to I arrived late, but I listened a little bit to Perry, and then listening to this wonderful story that your sister built, and knowing that we are joined by this large group of young people to listen of what is this about the storytelling or the power of stories that we organize jointly with the Idries Shah Foundation is really delightful. And I have to start by saying that our successful cooperation with you, with the foundation, Idries Shah, started in 2020 with this competition that we launched to ask young people around the world to share their unique perspectives on short stories related to their hopes, related to their future, their thoughts of their futures. And we received thousands of entries from 100 countries in all regions of the world. And I feel that this seminar or this webinar will help us to discuss how these stories benefit individuals, communities, and societies. In this very fast-paced world, sometimes we forget the power of the storytelling, not only in terms of bringing communities together, because it's a way of transmit knowledge, transmit values, get information out. But it's also important for growing up, for our well-being. We know that the scientists will say that storytelling really influences positively brain development and well-being. I know that storytellers and artists will say that the narratives bring communities together. But we also know, because UNESCO is the institution that is our mandate is to promote peace and to fight racism. We know also that this kind of stories, like the one you just saw about the onion, can also help us to counter some of the difficult trends that we confront sometimes, like racism, because we can build different narratives. We can build different ways of looking at the world. And by building those different ways and different storylines, we might be also contributing at imagining something different. I think this is a great way to continue thinking, continue developing concrete contributions, and also we need more creativity. The world needs more creativity, and what else than this young audience that we have that could help us to rethink the world and build it better as we go forward. I might finish that I was also a forced storyteller, because as a mother, you always need to tell these little tales to your children. But it's fun. I have to say that it's also fun. So good luck with this fantastic initiative. I wish you the best, and I wish I could stay longer with you. I will stay a little bit to continue benefiting from the participants. But in any case, we're looking forward to our continued cooperation in this fantastic topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. And you completely understand where we're coming from. It's wonderful to have the support of UNESCO in this. And I can't think of a better way of starting a webinar on the power of stories than with a story. So first of all, we have the wonderful treat of having a story read by really one of the best storytellers in the world, Perry Ground, who is a Turtle Clan member of the Iroquois, is going to tell us the traditional story of the rough-faced girl.
Nyaweskeno Gogoa, which means I give thanks that you are well. And I'm so glad you could all join us for today's story program. Well, we say this story happened a long, long time ago, back when the Great Turtle Island was brand new. And Great Turtle Island is what the Haudenosaunee, what we call ourselves in our own language, what the Haudenosaunee call this place that we live on. Most people call it Earth, but we call it the Great Turtle Island. Well, back when the Turtle Island was new, there was a village of Haudenosaunee people near the beautiful water, Ontario, that is near what is now called New York. And in this village of people, at one end was a large, long house. And in this long house lived a very special man, an invisible man, along with his sister. And the invisible man was said to be very, very handsome and very powerful and a wonderful hunter and an excellent lacrosse player. And all the women of the village wanted to marry the invisible man. But the invisible man had a sister who guarded the house, and she said, only the one who can see my brother will be allowed to marry him. Also in this village, there was a family who was very, very poor. And the man had lost his wife years before and raised his 3 daughters as best as he could. The 2 older daughters thought that they were very beautiful. They thought they were the most beautiful women in the whole village. And their younger sister, they thought was very ugly. And they were very mean to their sister. They made her do all the chores. They made her cook by the fire. And as the ashes from the fire and the sparks from the fire would fly up, it burned her face and her hands and her hair. Soon she had scars all over her body, and her face was very rough. "Oh, you are so ugly," said the older sisters. "Oh, you will never find a husband as ugly as you are, rough-faced girl." Well, one day the 2 sisters decided it was time to find a husband, and the 2 of them decided that they would marry the invisible man. So they went to their father, and they said, "Father, please, give us fine buckskin so we can make beautiful dresses, and give us lots of beads made of shell and porcupine quill so we have the most beautiful clothes." The father was very poor and did not have much, but gave to his 2 daughters everything that he had. They made fine outfits, and they strutted through the village, walking down towards the house of the invisible man. Everyone in the village, "Oh, they are so beautiful. Surely the invisible man will want to marry them." But when the sisters reached the house of the invisible man, the sister was waiting outside for them. And the sister looked at them, not only at their beautiful faces and their beautiful clothes, but she could see into their hearts. And she knew that they were not as beautiful on the inside. So very crossly she said, "Oh, why have you come here to my lodge? What is it that you want?" And the 2 sisters looked and they said, "Oh, we have both come to marry your brother. We are the most beautiful women in the village. Please let us in so we might get married." But the sister again, "Oh, have you seen my brother, the invisible one? Only someone who sees him can marry him." And the sister, "Oh, we have seen him for sure. If you have seen my brother, what is his bow made from?" And the sisters thought, and they said, "It is from the oak tree, the strongest of all the trees." But the sister shook her head, "No. If you have seen my brother, what is his sled made from?" "His toboggan." And the sisters thought, and they said, "Oh, it is the willow tree, the one that bends." And again, this is, "No, no." Oh, the two sisters, they thought, oh, please let us into the house. We must marry this man. But the sisters said no and sent them away. The two sisters had to walk back to their own house, very ashamed. Everyone laughed and pointed. The invisible man did not want them. Next day, the rough-faced girl woke up and said, Father, Father, perhaps I could marry the invisible man. Will you give me beads and buckskin to make clothes? But the father had no more to give, only scraps and small pieces of shell. He had moccasins, but they were very big for his own feet, not for a young girl. But the rough-faced girl took these things and made the best clothing that she could, which was still not very nice. She walked through the village, going towards the house of the invisible man, and everyone saw her with her raggedy clothes and her moccasins too big, flapping across her feet. Ha ha ha! Woo-hoo! The rough-faced one thinks she will marry the invisible man. Oh, she is so ugly. But the rough-faced girl, she had courage, and she knew she had to get to the invisible man. So she walked in front of everyone, even though she did not look very beautiful. When she came to the house of the invisible one, the sister again looked and saw inside of her heart. And she looked at the rough-faced girl and said, Sister, come inside. Come and sit down. My brother will want to meet you. Very gentle with the rough-faced girl. And then she said, have you seen my brother here in our village? The rough-faced girl said, I see him everywhere, everywhere in the beautiful world around us. I see his face. The sister said, if you have seen my brother, what is his bow made from? And the rough-faced girl thought and said, his bow is made from the colors of the rainbow. Oh, perhaps you have seen my brother, said the sister. What is his toboggan, his sled made from? And the rough-faced girl thought, the sled at the nighttime sky is the Milky Way, the band of stars across the sky. Oh, the sister smiled and gave the rough-faced girl food and shelter and took her in and sat her down. A bit later, in through the door comes the invisible man, and the rough-faced girl sees him. For the first time, he is very handsome, very beautiful. And he says, Sister, you have chosen well for me. This one is so beautiful. But the rough-faced girl said, no, I am very ugly. I have all these scars. And the invisible one said, you are so beautiful on the inside. So the sister took the girl down to the river and using some special magic washed her all over. And as she washed her, her hair, which had been burned, grew long and black and silky. The scars on her face and hands and skin magically disappeared. Then the sister took her back to the long house. The invisible one and the rough-faced girl were married. And to this day, we see them whenever the rains fall, and across the sky is the beautiful rainbow. And we say it is the invisible one with the rough-faced girl. At night, we look up into the sky and we see the Milky Way. And we say, there is the rough-faced girl with her husband, the Great Spirit. And to this day, when Haudenosaunee see those things, we give our thanksgivings and we are reminded that we see beauty all around us in the whole world. And now I will say to you, Daneho. Daneho in the language where I come from means I am done, or those are my words. It's like the end, Daneho. That story is done.
Thank you so much, Perry. That was a wonderful story. I absolutely adored it. And It means a particular amount to me because it is one of the stories my father collected in his book, World Tales, where he argued or believed that stories are the common possessions of all human beings, and they crop up all over the world in different versions. And there isn't a better story really to illustrate that. So Perry, let's have a chat then, because I'm so happy to be able to talk to you a little bit about this story and about what stories mean to you and to your clan.
Sure. Well, I'll introduce myself very quickly. My name again is Perry Ground, and I am a Turtle Clan member of the Onondaga Nation. And the Onondagas are one of the Native American tribes that lives in upstate New York, not by New York City, but in the upper part of New York State. And about 1,000 years ago, we joined together with 4 other tribes to form a confederacy, a union, called in our own language, Haudenosaunee, the people building the longhouse, but many other people call us Iroquois, or in America, Iroquois. And that name given to us by French explorers, and sometimes still called by that name today. But our people have been telling stories like that one that I just shared forever, because of course we had no written language like other parts of the world until Europeans came to live in North America. And so a lot of our stories explain who we are and how we view the world around us, our connection to the places where we live. And so where I am from is very much a forest area. So when we hear about a long house, this is a house made out of bark. When we hear about rainbows and rain and sleds for the wintertime, which is coming to us, these are all things that are part of our life. And so it reminds us of the place where we live and our connection to that place.
Perry, that's so interesting to me because I grew up, you could say I'm the child of immigrants, so I grew up in Britain. I was born and brought up in Britain, but my parents came from different places and we did not grow up in a community. I remember my father saying to me, he used to be a great storyteller as well. And I remember him saying, these stories are your community. Is that how your people feel about stories?
Absolutely. And many Native American people do. Today, I'm speaking about my tribe specifically and our union. Today, another tribe joined us 300 years ago. So today there are 6 of us, and not just 5. And so in our community, these stories are important because they bring our community together. And hundreds of years ago, we would hear these stories in the wintertime. And maybe one person from the family, the clan, not just the family, mother, father, brother, sister, but everyone related through this family line would tell these stories to bring the clan together, but then maybe travel to other villages so the entire tribe was connected in the same way. But other Native American peoples do this as well. We hear stories from Cherokee people, from Navajo people, from Athabasca peoples, all the Native peoples of North America. These stories are powerful and inform us where we belong and how we belong in that place.
And is there practical wisdom and know-how? Can you give me an example, if there is, it kind of hidden in these stories?
Sure. Yeah. Well, 2 things that spring to mind. There's a story I often tell about the black bear, and he loses his big, beautiful tail when it gets stuck in the ice in the wintertime because he's trying to ice fish. And so ice fishing is talked about in the story so that we all understand how to get food in the wintertime, which is very practical to have to go ice fishing. So right there is something practical that would keep us alive through that story. But in many stories, we talk about marriage, like in the one we heard, and it is the woman that proposes marriage in our communities, not the man. And so we hear many stories where a woman proposes marriage, which is also something very practical.
I like to hear that. And I'd love to take at least one question from the audience. I've got one in front of me from Kai, who says, what makes a good storyteller into a great storyteller?
Well, Kai, thank you for your question and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. I don't think of myself as a great storyteller. I think I am learning and learning and constantly learning. Right now, even though I am from New York, I am in Croatia, in Slavonski Brod, and have been in Zagreb for days to learn more about stories from this place. So the more I learn, the more I learn, the more I learn, maybe someday I will be a great storyteller. I hope so. But I'll keep on learning and keep on trying.
Perry, I think that is the answer of a true storyteller. And what I'd love to do now is I would love to trade you a story. I'm not going to tell it right now, but I have a story that is being read by my sister called The Onion, which is one of my father's stories. And again, it's one of the stories he collected, traditional stories he collected. And I would love to offer you this story between us. So perhaps my colleague will be able to play the video of The Onion, read by Safia Shah.
The Onion by Idries Shah. There was once a time and a town in which onions were rare, almost unknown. Then one day, a traveller dropped a large onion in the town's main square. The citizens, or many of them, were very interested in this curious new object. They could see that it was some kind of vegetable, but they wanted to know more. By chance, the first person to venture near the onion coughed as he approached. He immediately ran away to teach that onions cause coughs. The second person to inch near the onion found that it had a strong smell. If the outside is as strong as this, then the inside must be almost impossible to bear, he wept. So he left the onion alone. The third man to come close was braver, making a cut in the onion. A layer of it came off in his hand. "What a miraculous object," he cried to the crowd. "This object has magical qualities. You cut it, and it discards the whole of its outside, leaving an inside which is just the same." The next person who was brave enough to handle the onion stripped off its outer layer and tried cooking some of it. She realized that cooked onion was delicious when treated correctly. In fact, cooked onion was so delicious that she made quite a name for herself, teaching others to recreate the dish. As well as being very tasty, however many layers you tear away, this amazing vegetable always presents you with yet another layer, the cooks and the townsfolk exclaimed. "It seems to be getting smaller," someone remarked. "Nonsense," cried the townsfolk. "That's just an optical illusion." You see, they all wanted to believe that the onion was everlasting. And when the last layer had been ripped from the onion, everyone exclaimed, "It is undoubtedly a magical but yet a treacherous thing." And wiping their hands free from onion juice, they all agreed, as indeed was the most sensible thing to do, that people were better off, on balance, in a town without any onions at all.
Before we get into the many, many ways that stories can help to heal societies and many of the problems that they face, to heal individuals, but first of all, let's have a look at the science, because we are beginning to discover more and more ways that stories are hardwired into our brains and how many ways they can help us. Now, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Dr. Joseph Devlin of the Department of Experimental Psychology at University College London. And I asked him, are we hardwired for stories? Are we programmed for stories? There obviously stories have been part of our society for a long, long time.
As far as you can tell, I mean, forever. I mean, so we talk about language being unique to humans, but in some sense, what might be the really important part is storytelling. So there are lots of other animals that have things that would look like words to us, some animals that have sort of grammar, but what they don't have is any sort of narrative, whereas oral storytelling is our history long before writing came along, right? And it wasn't until 4,000 or 5,000 years ago that writing even existed. And even within that, it was still another several hundred years before they wrote down sentences and not just like lists and accounts. So that spoken narrative seems to be a deep part of what makes us human.
And can you just tell me about this immersion theory of stories? What's happening there?
So the idea there is just simply that you're not just passively consuming stories in whatever form. When you listen to a story and are engaged by it, or when you watch a story and are engaged by it, you are going through this mental simulation. You put yourself in the story. You know, it's this idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Stories are really good for that. And it's very hard to do that in other circumstances. If you just say, well, imagine what it's like for poor Tim at the moment, that's challenging. Whereas if you can tell Tim's story to someone, they almost can't help but imagine being in Tim's shoes. And that immersion is probably what's the real key to engagement. And what's fascinating is it means that you sort of live that experience. I mean, and we see that in people's brains, and we can see that to some extent in their behavior as well.
So how do you see that in people's brains?
So there's some really interesting work done where we put people in a brain scanner and just ask them to tell a story. And then we put people in the brain scanner and ask them to listen to that story. And what you see is that the patterns of activation in the storyteller's brains are actually then mirrored in the people who are listening to the story. So it's as if their brains are recreating the story as if it was told in the first person.
So they're telling the same story and the same parts of their brain are lighting up.
Yes, exactly.
That's really interesting. And then how about what's happening on a chemical level in our brains?
Well, that's a lot. So there are different aspects. So some of it's related to your reward system in the brain. So there are parts of stories that are more or less rewarding. And reward is often encoded by a chemical called dopamine in your brain. So for instance, when you're engaged in a story and you get to a high point, a culmination of a story, or it was just some lovely little moment that happened in the story, you get this little release of dopamine exactly as you would if you were, for instance, being in the story, you were living the story. But dopamine is only one of the chemicals involved. Stress is also one of the key elements of narrative, right? And of course, a good story develops some kind of tension. And stress is one of the things that's really strongly linked to cortisol in the brain. So as your stress levels go up, cortisol increases, and that can happen simply from being involved in the story. I don't like horror films, but people love them, and they love them because it's a safe way of experiencing fear, which causes this stress response, and you get increased cortisol levels in the brain that are measurable in the body. And you can see that, and you can see it resolve when scary clown dies or whatever the end of the crazy story is. And at that point, you're going to get the dopamine release. What we did was we picked scenes that were emotionally engaging. So for instance, from Game of Thrones, we picked the beheading of Ned Stark, where his daughter, Arya, I believe, sees her father killed in front of her, right? And of course, this is late in the story, and for people who've been engaged, it's a really emotional moment. And part of the way we chose it was because the video adaptation is really true to the book, so that the content was really comparable. And what we did was we asked volunteers to come in. They came into the lab, and they were fitted with a biometric sensor, which is essentially a watch. It's like a Apple Watch or a Fitbit, but just a little bit uglier. And the nice thing about this is it allows us to record heartbeat and galvanic skin response, which is a nice emotional proxy for emotional intensity. And all that we asked them to do was to listen to this scene, or for instance, watch the scene as a video, and nobody would do both. So if I came in, I might listen to the scene, whereas the next person who came in may see it as a video, and we would compare between people. And what we were able to do is then compare what we measure from their physiology, their heart rate and such, with what they said they experienced. So we just asked them questions about how much did you feel like you were, within the story? How much did you engage with the main character? How much was that point of view perspective something that you could identify with? How much attention did you pay? Basic questions about engagement. And they did this over a set of stories that they heard and a set of stories that they watched, and then we could compare the two. What we found was that when people just told us what they felt, videos win hands down, right? They definitely felt that they engaged to a greater extent with the videos than the audiobooks. And this was fascinating because this is obviously the way they're going to make consumer decisions. So if you go out and buy the story, I'm going to go watch the HBO adaptation versus buying the book or listening to the audiobook because I felt like I'm more engaged by it. But what was remarkable was that we see exactly the opposite in their physiology. That is to say, they show stronger heart rate, like their heart rates are higher on average by about 2 beats a minute, and their higher highs and lower lows, which is consistent with greater emotional amplification. So that is, the stronger you feel things, the higher it ramps up your heartbeat versus bringing it back down, which is, pretty good evidence that actually the emotional intensity is experienced stronger in the book than it is in terms of the video adaptation of the book. There's been some really fascinating work about how stories can improve empathy towards outgroups. So, for instance, there was this neat study that was done with kids in primary school where they were read different scenes from Harry Potter. So one scene was one of the muggle baiting incidents where, this character Hermione is this young girl who's not properly part of the wizarding community, right? And some of the other wizards are treating her very poorly about it. Whereas another scene that they read to the kids was about a Quidditch match, which is this exciting wizarding game. Had lots of highs and lows, but it didn't have anything interpersonal really happening in it. And what was fascinating was afterwards, if you asked children about their ideas about immigrants and whether or not they should be entitled to be, for instance, in schools with the kids are a lot more tolerant towards immigrants after listening to the sort of muggle baiting incidents than they are relative to the Quidditch, even though the storytelling is, it's all the same author and all the rest. And there's some really fascinating examples of that. I just love the fact that that's true in as young as primary school children.
So next we have with us Lucy Hawking. So perhaps we can get Lucy up. We weren't sure if she was going to make it on time, but she is. So I think we can unspotlight Ramsey and get Lucy up instead. And I will introduce her. Now, you are a wonderful and very accomplished science communicator in your own right. And you also are the daughter of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Stephen Hawking. And I know you have collaborated a lot with him when he was alive. And you had probably a choice of doing anything within science, and yet you have chosen to use stories to convey really complex scientific concepts to very young children. Why?
Well, I'm just going to rewind a bit there. My father, bless him, sitting over my shoulder there, beautiful black and white portrait that you can see. He didn't actually win a Nobel Prize. It was one of his greatest ambitions. And rather sadly, the last Nobel Prize for physics, or the last but one, was awarded to his lifelong colleague, Sir Roger Penrose, for his work on black holes. And Sir Roger very graciously said that had my father still been alive, they would no doubt have shared the prize. So there we are. Now, I'm actually a storyteller. I'm a writer, not a scientist. So I came to this whole idea of science communication from a very different aspect to scientists. And that was really very interesting and a very good place to start, because it all came about, this big project I did with my father and a lot of other world-leading scientists, to get them to write about their work in ways that young children could relate to and be entertained by, and have that same sense of wonder and discovery and joy that scientists experience through their work, but that somehow can get lost in the process of transferring science into education. So anyway, so this all started at my son's birthday party, because the little boy went up to my dad and, like, you know, very confidently said, "So, Stephen, tell me what would happen to me if I fell in a black hole?" And my father said, "You'd be turned into spaghetti." And so the children were very sort of excited by this idea. Of becoming spaghetti. And I realized the brilliance of that answer was that not only was it scientifically accurate, because there's a thing called spaghettification, but it was also relatable. It gave them an image. It took something from the everyday life of most children and it put it into this fabulous, exotic, extreme context, but it drew a link. And at the time when we started this project to make science accessible to kids, there really was a global level of concern that kids were not engaging with science. And so I said, well, I think we should try telling a story. I just think we should tell a story and see what happens. And in a way, we wrote the first book actually really for that boy at the birthday party for my son and for the other children in the room. And of course, we had no idea this was going to end up as a 7-book series and would sort of encompass the science of the whole universe through the method of storytelling. But you see, it speaks to the power of stories and the power of us being able to understand things that we think we can't reach for if we put them in an experiential context. And I love some of the content
Lucy,
we just heard about.
That's beautifully put. I love that. I love that you're answering the need of a little boy, and that, you know, that really the most famous physicist in the world takes that on board. And so then tell me about where the project went from there.
So we started off to write, as I said, 1 book, and originally it was going to be a book about basically the theory of everything. We were going to try and describe the whole universe in 1 book, and then we realized that even for us that was a bit of an overreach. So we thought we'd narrow it down to black holes. So it's a story about a boy and a black hole, and what happens if you fall into a black hole, and whether we can ever recover the person who's fallen into a black hole. But it's also about it's about home, it's about family, it's about friendships, it's about having a sense of adventure, it's about doing something that you don't think you can do, but managing to do it by finding out bits of information and piecing them together in order ultimately, you know, as in many good stories, to fight the forces of evil and restore good to the universe. So all this kind of comes together in this fabulous synthesis of adventure and science and storytelling. And then because we realized that we hadn't kind of achieved what we wanted to say in 1 book, and because it was very popular, because kids liked it. And you've got to think this was really one of the first books that attempted to put a narrative to very pure abstract science, you know, really.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. What is it about stories that help convey abstract ideas?
Yes, again, I think it's because I think what we just heard, right, about the science of stories, that you get that response, that both that physiological and that neurological response of experiencing. And because as humans, that's how we process our lives. We process them through our experience, and then we try and order it, whether it's by the stories we tell each other, the stories we read, the stories we see, even through our dreams. It's all about this kind of trying to find meaning in existence by an ordering of this kind of random thing called life that happens to us, and we're trying all the time to make sense of it, and stories just help us to do that. And we found this process of putting it into a story and then sort of discreetly adding information, building throughout a story, somehow helps you to do that, because you've gone on a journey, you've seen the universe through the eyes of 2 kids, and you've learned what they've learned. You found out what did they need to know in order to take the next step, to unpick, you know, the first book is called George's Secret Key to the Universe, and the secret key, of course, is knowledge, but it's also imagination. It's also having that intuitive imagination that allows you to make this next big leap.
I remember I was once giving a talk about stories, and someone stood up in the audience afterwards who must have been a scientist and said quite aggressively, well, everything you've been saying about stories, you must understand it does not apply to science. Scientists do not tell stories. But you and your father are the living contradiction of that. Carry on.
Well, we came up against this at the beginning with the first book. We had a bit of a backlash about, this is not how you teach kids science. This is not what children need. Why are you trying to do this? And we just actually, I'm afraid we, you know, my father's a pretty determined man, very famously in all sorts of ways. And he had always used relatable concepts to relay abstract ideas through his professional physics lectures, even, you know, the very high level ones. When I was a child, I used to draw a lot, and he used to have me draw the illustrations for his professional physics lectures. And they're all very silly, like a chicken looking at an egg and scratching its head going, well, I don't know which one came first, or somebody looking for their, you know. So he'd always, to an extent, used humor, adventure, storytelling, and this idea of relatable concepts throughout his work. And so extrapolating that into children's stories for him wasn't a big leap. But, you know, the Brief History of Time caused a bit of commotion, because at the time there was this idea that it wasn't okay to be popular and to be a physicist. I mean, that was, you know, explicitly stated, you can be popular or you can be a physicist, but you can't be both. So he'd already done quite a lot of iconoclasm. And of course, you know, being profoundly disabled at a time when disabled people were not really supposed to be seen nor heard. So, you know, if there were barriers to be broken down, quite happy to do it. And we just felt very strongly that we tried these stories on kids. We tried talking to kids. We tried talking about them. What did they want to know about? How did they want to know about this stuff? And the responses we got belayed the kind of criticism we also received. And yes, I mean, I do fundamentally, I agree. I understand what the scientists were saying, because science and stories for the mind of a scientist don't necessarily go together. And this is something that we had to put quite a lot of work into, in order, sort of working with the scientists we worked with, working with the kind of public understanding of science. But I think you'll find it's pretty established now that in order to convey science to a general or a young audience, an audience that doesn't have a specialist background in it, that narrative is an extremely useful tool.
And the role of the imagination. I know you want to play us a little video about the imagination. Could you just introduce it, and then we'll play it? Yeah.
I just wanted to say something, that I do a lot of work with kids. I've just been away. I've just been doing workshops with a wide range of children, where the children from a school of very different abilities to children with very high level of ability. And to an extent, this idea of using your imagination and linking that to science is really important, because a lot of young people don't realize that scientists use their imagination. And I've got a whole section in my talk, different scientists talking about the value of imagination to them. And one of the most powerful quotes is from Fabiola Gianotti, who's brilliant scientist. And she says, imagination is the fuel of science. And so this is another idea I want to get across to kids, is the creativity and the imagination of science. And that's what this little animation that we made, which finishes my talks, it is narrated by my father, which is just lovely, because it's really nice to have that reminder of him, what he stood for, what he tried to do, and his belief in science for everybody.
Imagine if we could build a city on the moon, where people live and work, and kids go to school, where supplies arrive by space elevator, and spaceships arrive and leave every week. This is possible. Imagine if all the plastic in the seas could be recycled to make clean energy. We could light our homes, fuel our cars, and give the fish a clean ocean to live in. This is possible. Imagine if you could have a robot for a friend. Your robot could take you to school. It could cut your hair, it could brush your teeth, and read you a story. This is possible. So many things are possible, but you have to imagine them first. Can you imagine a future that no one else has thought of?
That's absolutely lovely, Lucy. Thank you so much. Thanks for that contribution. And I would like, it's just been wonderful to have you. And I do hope you'll stay, because we've got lots more exciting things going on I think I'd like to move on actually now to from the scientific side to what stories can do for human beings, both on a cultural level and in a therapeutic level generally. And I think maybe first of all, we've got a few little elements in this section, but I think I would like to start with another video of an interview I did with Dr. Aisha Ahmed. And she is from St George's Hospital Medical School in the University of London. And she is really an expert on trauma in an intercultural context. And she has used traditional stories with many groups of people, including women in Afghanistan. And I would love, as we go into this next section, for us to hear what Aisha has to say about this subject.
Traditional stories, they become traditional because they have a legacy. There's a power and potency about them that has made them still present and relevant to contemporary society. And I find that in the context where I work, even though there are contexts that have been disrupted by conflict, that are still structured by censoring, and because of conflict, people have not had access to education in the way that they would have been able to exercise their potential without the conflict. They still know their history in terms of the poets, the storytellers. They still have a respect for the storytellers within their society, the mediators. So I think that particularly those stories represent that cultural heritage, and that becomes very important when working in contexts where so much of the fabric of their surrounding world has been destroyed, that stories can represent actually this is something that somebody created and it lasted.
So this sort of taps into a network that people already have in their brains and in their society.
And it's a network that in some of the contexts, particularly in Afghanistan, this network was still going on during very extreme times of conflict.
So tell me about your project. How do you use these stories and with whom?
So the first project my colleagues and I did was in Afghanistan. And again, that was in some ways an ideal situation, a tragically ideal situation, because it has suffered so much conflict, but also it's still juxtaposed with this extremely rich storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I don't just mean a written story or verbal story, but poetry, all forms, proverbs, all forms of expression. And there's very little mental health infrastructure, but of course there's the people's experiences of trauma. Also, the area that we focused on is trauma related to gender-based violence situated in conflict, which has been another area that's been untouched and overlooked because it's very sensitive and for lots of reasons. So in a lot of, when we're thinking about how would you design a trauma therapeutic intervention using stories in this context, what are the realistic expectations? Someone is not going to recover in the way that recovery is conceptualized if you're going to seek psychological therapy in London, for example. So what realistically could be the impact? So we use stories as a way of having symbolism. So it's symbolic to be able to create those spaces where those stories can still be reflected on, and also the need for stories to be in society in a free way in order for progressive social change to occur. So that's why while we conducted semi-structured life narrative interviews, we did not ask the women that we'd worked with, even though we knew that they'd experienced gender-based violence because it was situated in safe houses. We did not ask about their stories of violence. We know that the wider discourse around particularly Muslim women has been very reductionistic in their experiences of how they become voiceless, passive, silent victims. So we wanted to counteract that. So we would ask instead questions about, can you tell us poems, stories, or songs of your childhood? And those answers actually revealed the ways that conflict and violence impacts on stories. So one of the women might say, well, I had no one to read me a story or tell me stories because I was an orphan, or so their violence became interspersed within their reflection on stories. Then we also had what's called focus groups. So these were a group of women within the safe house, and that is where the trauma intervention that we've been developing was tried.
So the story, or in this case the poem, became a safe way, a safe sort of metaphor for what the women themselves had gone through.
Yes, almost a form of disclosure without having to disclose.
You're suggesting that society is richer in this resource of stories perhaps than we are, that they have this bank of stories.
Yes. I mean, even here, if I ask a young Afghan man and walking around the streets of London, tell me about Rahman Baba, he knows him. But if you ask some of even of my generation who are, Englishmen, about the poets of our time, they have no idea. There's no presence in the society for them. So I think it's that because I was coming from a mental health perspective and thinking about trauma. A lot of the mental health interventions are around training primary healthcare professionals in mental health, which is fine. But if you're working in a context which is so little what is known as Western biomedical paradigms of understanding mental health, then why put the resources into developing that when you have a resource such as the existence of the traditional stories that can be such a rich way of responding to trauma? Why not tap into that instead?
I grew up with Mullah Nasruddin stories. I don't know, did you as well you didn't, but I did. So this is almost like a building block of stories. It's like something that everyone has in common. Everyone knows these stories. What was the benefit of them? Was it reassurance? Did they have, what do you think was the benefit of those stories in a therapeutic context?
So this was a therapeutic context, specifically thinking about trauma, and in a very descriptive way rather than a technical way. Trauma is something is traumatic because it disrupts your sense of self and the way that you perceive the world around you. Whereas stories are actually the tool that we use to make sense of the world around you. So in this context, those stories were ways that could be used and navigated and instrumentalized to those individual experiences, even though they were also shared on a collective level as well. So the same story can be used in a different way, depending on that time and what is going on in that time in that person's life. That's why I hoped, and my colleagues as well, that the stories could be symbolic for a social change as well. And I even though, of course, elder men or the poet of the village or there's traditionally been a man, women have always been the creators as well of stories, the weaving of carpets, embroidery, their own poetry, but that just has not been elevated, and it's often been silenced because of what those narratives could contain, that might be things that certain people don't want to
too dangerous, too subversive.
Yeah.
So that was an interview I did recently with Dr. Aisha Ahmad, and I'm hearing stories are tools that we use to make sense of the world. I'm hearing this from different speakers now who come from completely different angles, and it's something that resonates with me. As I said, grew up with stories. A lot of traditional stories from an Eastern background, and a lot of them, in terms of the content, had some sort of therapeutic value. They taught one some sort of a lesson. And we have with us today Ramsey Wood, who is a co-founder of the College of Storytellers, and he's going to tell us a story that, again, is from my father's collection, and it's one that I remember very well being told when I was a kid. So I'm looking forward to hearing it told beautifully by Ramsey today. Thank you, Ramsey.
Right, I am reading this story. Reading a story is quite different from storytelling because I'm on the page, whereas the storyteller, as we just heard with Perry, lifts the words right off the page and puts them in his body or her body Anyway, but this story needs to be read, I think. Here we go. The lion who saw his face in the water. There was once a lion who lived in the desert, which was very windy. And because of this, the water in the holes from which he usually drank was never still. For the wind riffled the surface and never reflected anything. One day, this lion wandered into a forest where he hunted and played until he felt rather tired and thirsty. Looking for water, he came across a pool of the coolest, most tempting, and most placid water that you could possibly imagine. Lions, like other wild animals, can smell water, and the scent of this water was like ambrosia to him. So the lion approached the pool and extended his neck to have a good drink. Suddenly, though, he saw his reflection and imagined that it must be another lion. Oh dear, he thought to himself, this must be water belonging to another lion. I'd better be careful. He retreated, but then thirst drove him back again. And again, he saw the head of a fearsome lion looking back at him from the surface of the pool. This time, our lion hoped that he might be able to frighten the other lion away. And so he opened his mouth and gave a terrible roar. But no sooner had he bared his teeth than, of course, the mouth of the other lion opened as well. And this seemed to be, to our lion, an awful and dangerous sight. Again and again, this lion retreated and then returned to the pool. Again and again, he had the same experience. After a long time, however, he was so thirsty and desperate that he decided to himself, lion or no lion, I am going to drink from that pool. And lo and behold, no sooner had he plunged his face into the water than the other lion disappeared. That's it.
Thank you so much, Ramsey. Thank you. And I still remember when I first heard that story, I was quite a little kid, and my dad carrying on until all the kids had understood it was a reflection and not another lion. It took us really quite a long time. But next I would like to introduce Stephen Brooks, who's been waiting patiently, I know, since the very beginning of the webinar, because Stephen, we're beginning to really enter on your territory here, I think, which is the therapeutic use of stories. I know you use stories and metaphors all the time in your work. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
The thing about stories, they have universal appeal. And there are certain elements that everybody understands and can identify with, especially if you talk about nature in stories, even going to prehistory, sitting around a fire, looking at the stars, all of these elements, the rain, the clouds, the thunder, everybody's experienced these to a certain extent. And so any stories that have these as the cast of characters can be meaningful for almost anybody. So firstly, in therapy, no two clients are the same or two patients are the same. They have their different needs. So you need to create a story that somehow they can identify with and an emotion, basically. Now, the idea of using stories therapeutically is based on the principle of creating a story that runs in parallel to the strategy or the steps or the sequence of a person's problem, but then suggesting a resolution to that problem. And the reason we do it in metaphor and analogy is because if you just give advice to somebody directly, quite often they'll go, yes, maybe yeah, I know, I don't like that idea. They can reject it because they come in with their own ideas about what needs to be done. And generally these ideas are wrong, because if they were right, they probably wouldn't need to be there in the first place. So we want to bypass that conscious limiting belief of what needs to be done in order to get better or to get over a particular problem, regardless of whether it's a phobia, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety or whatever. We need to find some other way that we can slip in the back door and give suggestions to the client, which are innovative and new, that they hadn't thought about, that will then inspire them to go ahead and make the changes they need to do in their life. So I've found that storytelling is an amazing tool for bringing about therapeutic change in people. And that's what I use nearly all the time. Yeah.
How did you get onto it? How did you start? How did you realize that to start with? Because it's not really very Western in a way. I grew up with that idea, but it's not a very Western idea.
Well, I'm Buddhist, so there may be a part of a teaching component to this. You know, I've been Buddhist since I was a teenager. And of course, Buddhism is based on teaching principles, ways of living, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just a faith or religion. It's a psychology, if you like. And so when I'm doing therapy, I'm also a teacher. But I don't promote myself as a teacher because it's a different context. But therapy is about kind of teaching. It's about representing something, role modeling something to help a client. But of course, again, we don't want to do it directly in case that the suggestions we're given are rejected or just not even considered at all. We want to sow some seeds in the stories that will then initiate some kind of aha moment in the client. And I think this is so important because if you go to a therapist and the therapist is very direct, like a counseling context where they tell you you've got to do this and do that and do this and do that, you know, it's a bit authoritarian, number one. And who are we to say what someone else should do when everybody you see is different? I think it's important for the client or the patient to be able to evolve and change in accordance with their own personality. And the only way we can do that is to initiate the change through some kind of story that inspires, rather than giving them a kind of a rote learned set of steps they can tick off to get better. And I think, you know, movement or motivation comes through having emotion. Emotion I see as the fuel that drives motivation, and the motivation leads to action. And in any therapeutic context, what you're looking for is action. You're looking for a change in behavior, a change in the way a person feels and thinks. And so a story that initiates a change in the thought, that then initiates a change in the emotion, and initiates a change in the behavior, is going to be very effective for helping a client.
And we've got a question from the audience. Does listening to a story have the same healing effect as telling a story? Is storytelling a soul medication for both the creator and the admirer? Does he, maybe this person means the creator and the person who's listening to it. I don't know, is it a two-way street, storytelling and listening?
I've spent most of my life telling stories, so I can only say, well, yes, I feel good
haven't
about
been
that.
listening.
No, I've been listening to my own stories. I think if you're telling stories which are inspiring, you can't help but get a bit of that for yourself. But no, to answer the question to your listener, it's really the person who's listening. You know, that's the person who gets the most benefit. And let me just mention a little bit about stories in therapy. What we've been talking about so far are stories about culture, about understandings, perceptions that come from different cultures. Now, if you're working with a client, what stories do you tell? It has to be stories that they can relate to directly themselves. So the best way I've found in doing something therapeutic is not to tell a story from the past, but tell a story from the very present. That is the moment you're with that client. And so what I do is I listen to the client's ups and downs and all the mistakes they've made, and I can see where they're stuck. And if I can see where they're stuck, I know how to get them unstuck. So I have to create a story in the moment, spontaneously, specifically for them, that mirrors the structure of their problem and their frustrations and the errors they've made, and then suggest an outcome, a way of getting out of that. I can't do that by reciting a well-known folk tale, for example, unless it happens to be really very, very specific. So I have to be very general. I still use things like nature because people can identify with them. with that. But what I want to do is to create a story at the moment. And I think what is strange for me is, and I didn't really realize this until it was starting to happen. Initially, I kind of worked out stories, thought about what would work here. But I think like anything else, if you want to learn something, if you do lots of repetition, like playing the piano, eventually your hands play without you having to think about it. And so I started creating stories in the moment. And when I started a story, I had no idea how it ended. And this became absolutely fascinating, of course, because it's scary at first. But then when you realize there's a part of you that knows how to do it, it's no different from playing an instrument or driving a car, anything that becomes all automatic. It's the same process. So these are stories which are created in the moment. Sometimes I'll use the same story again with another client, depending if they're a similar client. But quite often, every story, I haven't even heard it myself when it happens. And for me, I suppose I am a storyteller, but I'm actually a story creator, if you like. But the raw materials are the person I have in front of me. So they should be taking the credit for the story. I'm just a facilitator of the story.
I remember my brother saying to me years ago, because he's a very, very prolific writer. I remember him saying half jokingly, "Oh yeah, I write all day, and then in the evening I look back and I see what my fingers have written." And I loved that. I was like, wow, he was really in the flow there. I thought that was fabulous. Thank you so much, Stephen. That is such an insight into how you work and how you achieve the amazing results you do. I would love to introduce Robert Twigger actually straight after you, because I think we're beginning to move now into people who use stories and creatively, which obviously Stephen, you do too for a therapeutic aim, and now we're moving into the world of culture and the arts. And Robert, you are another prolific writer, storyteller, you polymath, you write across different genres, and yet you come back again and again to the traditional story form. Can you tell me about that?
Well, the thing about traditional stories is that they're just such a stripped down version of what a story is. And by looking at them, you begin to understand, how to make your own stories, because in fact, it's not, despite what Stephen was saying, it's not easy for lots of people to make up stories. And if you ask someone, what is a story? They're often a bit stumped. They say, well, it's overcoming a problem, it's conflict. But I mean, for me, the blinding sort of recognition of what a story was Keith Johnston, who's this kind of genius improviser, said a story is simply something that reuses something that came before. It's just such a simple idea. So what happens is if you start the story by somebody seeing a stick, and then a little bit further on somebody's got another stick, you've got a story. And if it's the same stick, it's even better story.
And then you start tying it together.
It automatically, and this is what we heard before, you automatically start telling the story. We are automatic storytellers. All you have to bear in mind is when you tell a story, lots of people are looking forwards and trying to think they need to put more stuff in it, but actually you look backwards and you reverse into the story, and you simply integrate the material that's come before, which brings me to, it sort of ties up a lot of what people have been saying, because I believe stories are how we digest experiences, and we digest them by using this, literally a story is unpacking material again and again in lots of different ways. And of course, the richer the story, the more ways it's been unpacked, and therefore we've been able to digest it better. And so that's really what I find intriguing about stories.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I've actually also read a lot of Keith's work, and I'm a great admirer of his too. And I do something now with my kids that he talks about in one of his books, which is I begin a story with them, and then I get them to tell me what happens next. And they actually already, I mean, they're now 5.5, but even before 5.5, they already know the structure of a story. They already know what should happen next, exactly what you're saying, that factors should come back you know, you don't start something and then something goes off in another angle. It really does seem that we are quite hardwired for a certain sort of story structure here.
Well, from traditional stories, the famous Russian theorist Vladimir Prop studied hundreds of Russian folk tales, and he boiled it down to about 7 main characters and 31 situations that occur all the time, and it's variations on those. And even the most sophisticated stories can be broken down into those moves. And when you boil those moves even further down, they're often about somebody learning about themselves and about the world and trying various options and becoming a better person and improving themselves. So there's a kind of deeply moral element even in the most simple of stories.
And then we've got a couple of questions from the floor, so I'm going to put them to you. I think they really are for a writer, these stories, these questions. One is from Tashvia. What should be the real purpose of storytelling? Writing stories can connect communities, but what should the storyteller expect out of this art? Does that resonate?
It's a tricky, yeah, totally. I mean, I think storytelling is brilliant, and I love it when I'm stuck in the company of the storyteller, but I don't go out of my way to go to storytelling events. I don't go out of my way.
I think this person means telling a story even within a book. You know,
oh, right,
actually
okay.
telling a story. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I think the purpose of storytelling is, and writing stories is precisely that, to unpack things in multiple ways rather than in a linear and a single interpretation, which is what academic or scientific analysis is.
So you're using the whole part of your brain, or a different part of your brain?
You're using all parts of your brain and a much wider context, so it sticks in lots of different areas.
Maybe I can bring Stephen back in there, actually, if he's, I don't know if you're listening, Stephen, but yep. We're just talking about using different parts of your brain. Do you sort of agree with that Robert was saying that academics are using very much, you know, the tip of their brain, and using very much the intellectual part, but with stories you're mixing and matching, you're kind of using more holistic parts of your brain?
I think definitely. I mean, imagination, where is imagination? You know, if we have a free range to think of anything, there's no critical conscious mind saying that doesn't work, you know, because it's a dream world, you know, and we use a part of our brain that can dream and imagine and go anywhere. So I think a story will trigger that part of the brain. And I do think, because I work with hypnosis quite a bit, I do believe that stories actually induce hypnotic states, trance states, because they're encompassing, and someone listening to a story forgets where they are. They're not aware of the external reality. They become part of that story. That's a trance. And so in that state, we haven't got that critical conscious mind limiting what we can believe or not. I think people are able to take on stuff and believe things that previously they maybe wouldn't have believed, because they allow themselves to go into that trance-like state and have their emotions stimulated, which then initiate, of course, other changes. So absolutely different parts of the brain.
Robert, do you want
Saira,
to pick up from that? Yeah, sure. Who have we got there? Perry, yeah.
This is Perry, yep. I just wanted to follow up on something Stephen just shared with us. As a storyteller, and all of us here as storytellers, we see that in the audience. When I'm on the stage, we know the storytelling look when the audience is in that trance and they are wide-eyed and maybe open-mouthed and looking at us. And we see that the story is happening inside of their own head. Their eyes may follow us, but the story is happening internally, and the change that they are experiencing stays with them. But then also for children, since I worked in schools for so long, children like to act out stories. And so the way I tell my stories in the very physical way, it not only is affecting the brain, but I think as children then take the stories and play with them and act them out, and they think of the physicality, like in my style of telling stories, it is also a physical, not only mental response that they have and that they can build from. and grow from.
Well, this is becoming such an interesting discussion. I don't want to cut it short, but I would like to bring in Tawona because this fits right into your territory as well. So I don't want to leave you out because I haven't yet had a chat with you. And Tawona is a talented poet, playwright, storyteller, musician, and your UNESCO artist in residence at the University of Glasgow. And here we are suddenly all connected by our passion for stories. So I would love to bring you in at this point, Tawona, to join in the discussion.
Hello, Saira. Hello, everybody. Sorry,
Hi,
I'm
Tawona.
a little bit late joining you all. I was having some connection problems.
It's absolutely lovely to see you there. And of course, you come from, we were talking earlier in another discussion about your inspirations for storytellers. And can you tell me who your biggest inspirations were when you were a kid?
Thank you, Saira. It's I remember from our conversation that we spoke about your dad, and I've been enjoying listening to some of his lectures. For me, it was my grandmothers in my own family tradition. The grandmothers are the storytellers, and I think what they brought for me was the magic that language can bring to create other worlds, other meanings, and other senses of being. So they really brought me from, growing up in Harare, being a sort of a typical urban child and not quite engaging with the language at the level that they, you can imagine my grandmother's sort of quite frail during the day with their walking sticks in their late age. But when story time comes, when the fire, it feels like the fire is resting, late at night, the fire has done all these things through the day. In the morning, it's heated the water for people to have their bath. And then it's mid-morning, the ironsmith has put an iron in the fire, and someone is blowing the furnace into the fire. Someone has come to borrow a log from the fire so they can start another fire at lunchtime, cooking the meal. And then, all the things that happen during the day. Someone has roasted some nuts at mid-afternoon, and then evening meal and water for bath for those returning from, grazing their cattle and goats. And then at night, after all is done, the fire is the slow kind of flickering magical sense, and you've got the surroundings of the country around you, and then the stories come. So that's some of what the magic was for me, and experiencing language in that space where it was just magical and really inspiring. So I still carry that within me today.
So that's the zone we've all been talking about, really, that Perry's been talking about, that Stephen's been talking about, that Robert's been talking about, that Ramsey, I'd like to bring you in if you want to jump in at any point. I mean, we're all storytellers around the table here in a way. It's this sort of holistic sense that things are possible, or emotion is loose, or who would like to come into that?
All I was going to say was there was quite a bit of research years ago about people reading fiction, which I suspect you're aware more women read fiction than men. But they found out that there was a state that they would go into, which they call story worlds, where they actually had left this existence, which we're normally in, and were, let's say 80% in the story. And I just thought the word story worlds from a piece of paper in your hand was a great phrase.
Tawona, does that speak to you?
I love this word too. Thanks, Ramsey. I'm thinking of moments of, story making. I can also suggest, because what happens quite often, an incident has just emerged within us. Maybe it's a dispute, maybe it's a disagreement, it's a fight, or it's a difficult situation. So sometimes stories come at that. Sometimes stories are just said as it's story time, and the stories come. But there's also this stories coming in as a bit of an intervention, and then so what the storyteller will do will listen to everything that's going on, and the storyteller will offer a story into the space, and so everyone is transported into another world where they can maybe distance themselves from the immediacy, and they can maybe reimagine themselves as different or parts of certain characters in that story. And what the story does is it doesn't, there's a lot of talk of how elders, settle situations and all, but most of the time the story is offered and the story sits there and everyone finds a way of, being imbued in that story. And I think there's a magic to that as well. A story as a social piece of, I guess, peace building of a kind.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a question that I think must be for you, Tawana, from the audience. Alpha says, I'm going to try and read it in French. I'm sure the simultaneous interpretation will kick in if anyone doesn't understand it. Que faire pour réhabiliter le conte tel qu'il se racontait au village la nuit autour d'un feu de bois? Which I guess I would translate as, how would you rehabilitate the story in the same way, to bring it about the same way as it would have been told in the village at the night around a wood fire. So what you were describing, Tawana, that wonderful sense that the fires are lit and the stories being told, how could you reconstruct that?
Thank you. This is a very good question. For the past 13 years or so, I've been alongside with my brother and my wife as well, Tanim. We have been running a night at the Center for Contemporary Arts, where we have really been trying to attend to the gathering as a space where everyone feels they are present and contributing, whether or not they are saying anything or playing an instrument. And there is something about the creation or the curation of the space and working towards that sense that we are, because the fire I spoke of, there's a warmth, there's a sitting in a circle where the circle has no linear entry or exit points. So I think the real magic, thank you for this question, the real magic here is creating that sense in the way that you find. For me and my brother and my wife now, we have just looked at the space we have and we've seen what maybe the space might be doing unintentionally sometimes of inhibiting the story, the sense of the story happening. So we have music instruments. We have our mbira, which is an ancient instrument from Zimbabwe. So we play music. The mbira music helps to, create that atmosphere. Sometimes we have, artifacts or objects that we share with the audience, and the call and response is a big part of it, because the story always happens with the whole group participating. So we have, even though, we sometimes find ourselves in venues where you've got front on seating and all these things, but you can, with all these other elements of the story, inviting people in, teaching people a little poem, a little song that moves the story along, all these kind of different elements are part of trying to recreate that energy. I don't know if that's somehow, yeah.
I think that's a tremendous answer. Has anyone else briefly got something to say to that? Otherwise, I'll move on to our last section and we can come back to a little discussion afterwards. Perry, yes.
Yes, thank you again. And Tawana, thank you. That was an excellent answer. But one thing that I do with stories also is accept that we are in a modern world and that we are going to hear stories differently today than maybe we once did. Wonderful if we can recreate that environment and that atmosphere of storytelling, but going to the story world happens here in an apartment or here by the computer or on the written page. And so wonderful when we can recreate that environment, but that is sometimes hard to do. And so to accept that we can go to the story world from anywhere and especially in the modern way today on the computer with all types of multimedia, go to the story world is the important part, not how you get there.
That's a lovely answer. And I think on that note, I would love to introduce Ines Siddiqui, our final guest. And I'm very much hoping we'll have a chance to come back to everybody at the end. Because Ines, really the question is, can stories, maybe you want to unmute yourself, Ines, can stories change the world? We've seen that stories can change our brains, they can change our lives. Can they actually make society a better place? Can they build bridges? Now, Ines Siddiqui is president and founder of Get Up, and you are a network of young actors for change who work to enhance the images of disadvantaged neighborhoods in France through storytelling, networking events, and leadership. Ines, tell me about your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm very glad to be part of this, and I was very inspired by what I heard, and those stories are very, very powerful. Thank you for putting this together. So yeah, we, as you said, storytelling is one big aspect of our work in terms of working towards equality and inclusion where we live. And for me, the power of stories has a tremendous impact on two levels. The first one is obviously on an individual level, telling someone's story, telling their parents' story, just like we did with our web documentary Nodal, which means our parents, is something that really gives value to who you are and why you're in a society. Yes.
So you made a documentary with the stories of people who'd come from other countries as immigrants to France, and then you showcase those for their children, I believe.
Exactly.
Tell me about that. Yeah.
Yes. So it's a documentary that talks about stories of immigration and what our parents brought with them to Europe and to the different countries they came to in terms of culture, in terms of like hard work and passion for those countries. And so it has a very important impact on the youth because they see their parents differently. They see their parents in a positive way. So it really counters the negative narrative that we can hear in Europe around immigration, for example. And so that, it gives them a sense of pride, but also of belonging, right? So we are French. This is how we are French. And I think it's really important in young person's development to really feel like they belong in the country they live in. And the second way it has an impact is that it tells a story on us, like on the level of society, right? So it creates a story where everyone is included and everyone has, a seat at the table. And I think it's really important because what we hear today are stories that tear us apart, and we need stories that unite us. And this is what we try to do with this project.
And so Ines, let's play one of the videos you have with some of the testimonies of immigrants who have come to France talking about their lives before they arrived.
Ton meilleur souvenir dans ton département d'origine?
Je me rappelle plus jeune, on avait un voisin qui avait un terrain avec plein de fruitiers, plein d'arbres fruitiers, plein d'arbres et on allait lui piquer en fait ses fruits. Et c'était marrant parce que lorsque mes parents achetaient des fruits, ça n'avait pas la même saveur, c'était moins bon. C'est mieux d'aller piquer les fruits du voisin, c'est beaucoup mieux. Et c'était marrant parce qu'en fait, il nous courait après, il allait chercher sa machette et nous courait après. Mais et maintenant, je me dis, avec une machette, mais en fait, maintenant, je me dis qu'en fait, il voulait juste nous faire peur, il nous aurait jamais fait mal. Mais en fait, ça devait même l'amuser aussi, je pense, parce que je vous ai déjà dit de ne pas venir sous mes frais. Il courait à 2 à l'heure. Et c'était assez marrant.
Du coup, mon meilleur souvenir en Guadeloupe, je pense que c'est un souvenir pareil, un peu tout bête, mais juste toute la famille sur la véranda en train de manger tous les dimanches. En plus, ça, c'est un truc très antillais. Le dimanche, les repas du dimanche, c'est hyper important.
That in a way, it seems you're almost creating the kind of founding myths of a new community that's coming, a hybrid between people who've come from outside into France.
Yeah, this is our dream, to be able to create a story that starts today, where everyone has a role to play and feels like they belong and they can bring something to the table. Because it's the case, it's just like we haven't renewed this like idea of a society with people from various backgrounds bringing like different things to the table. And I think this is what we should all try to do, and we should all try and start doing that as early as possible. And I think it's really powerful for young people to really understand that and feel like they're able to shape this story to millennials, but Gen Z and the next generations.
And have you seen results from this?
Yeah, so especially in the workshops we run in schools. So since January, we've been able to run those workshops for more than 600 youth in their classes. And we see the difference when they enter the room, when we ask us to like share words with us on what they think immigration is, or what they think like the country they live in is. And they have negative words, or they feel like they're outside of it. And by the end of the session, they think about themselves more positively, They want to get involved more in society. They want to tell their stories. They get back home, they ask questions to their parents, and they feel empowered, and they want to hear other stories. And so that thing, I think, is really the power of this project.
And I'm wondering if that what Ines is saying is resonating with anyone else. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to come in on? I see Torona putting her hand up there somewhere. There you go. Come on in, Torona.
Thank you so much, Ines, for the great work you're doing. I think I just want to add that, you know, what you're describing, Ines, is making me think of the many ways that stories exist. So you have the condensed story, which becomes a one-liner. For example, you know, with the issue of people moving around the world, you have then people have these one-liners. They'll just say, you know, migrants come to take, you know, these notions develop. And then those are the condensed forms of stories that people grab with them. And we see them on newspaper headlines, we see them on different spaces. So those, as you say, you know, those are the stories that tear us apart. But yeah, I was just wanting to add that, you know, the stories come condensed, and quite a lot of the time, people only take that condensed form of a version of a certain story, and that's all they have not engaged with anything to do with that whole experience. You know, quite a lot of people have never sat and had a conversation with someone from that experience that is being described. So the condensed story is also quite it's very mobile in society.
Yes,
almost like
exactly.
Yeah, almost like a little sort of cultural meme, a little mnemonic or something that takes you somewhere. Yeah, that's great. And would anyone else like to talk on to the end of Ines, or shall I just throw open the floor? We're nearly winding up now, so I would love to have maybe from each of you just a little impression, quite a short one, of what you feel you've learned today from the other people on the panel, what you will take with you from this, and maybe use in your own storytelling or use of stories. Who would like to begin? Does anyone feel inspired to begin while everyone else tries to think what to say? Stephen.
I think what is very obvious is...
Stephen, carry on.
I think it's very obvious that everybody tells stories because they want to make a difference. They know that stories can bring about change for individuals or groups. In this case, she's a therapist. She's actually doing therapy with groups of children, which is amazing, you know, to reach that many people through stories is incredible. You know, I'm limited by a one-on-one with people when I work as a therapist, but to do it with whole groups, she's doing therapy. And I think this comes across with everybody who's shared stories and the way they work today, is that we are all doing it because we believe in people and we want to make a difference to the lives of others. And I think that is really the true essence of what stories accomplish.
That's lovely. Would anyone else like to add a closing thought? Has anyone else got anything they want to say as we come towards the end of this webinar? I see Robert waving at me. Robert.
Yeah, what I shall take away was watching Perry and seeing the power of using your whole body to tell the story. You let your body do the talking. And I shall take that away. There's lots of other great things as well, but that just stuck in my mind.
Absolutely, that's a wonderful one. And Tuone, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just want to say that I think for me, and apologies to everyone for joining late, but I think the power of imagination is very important as a way of us being in the world. You know, the world that we're in, we have so much to critique around it, but we can only, you know, make a better one, or one that we feel is a better one, by using our imagination. So this idea of journeying into the story world is a gem that I'll take away with me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ines.
No, it just gave me inspired me to you know, hear other, like, more stories from other places, from other people. And I guess I also just wanted to say that, you know, maybe you can drop a link in the chat, but some of our episodes from the web documentary are translated in English, or have subtitles in English. And I would love that, you know, the stories of the different parents and children that we interviewed could be seen by people all over the world. And I think it would also, you know, bring a lot to the table. So just wanted to say that.
We will definitely put links up. Yes, I'm sorry we didn't manage to play one just now. And Ramsey.
I just wanted to point out that this event is reminding me that we're always in a story. The problem is you have to remember it at the right time.
Lovely, I love that. And we've got Lucy.
Yeah, first of all, I must apologise. I've had an array of unexpected technical issues today, but I've really enjoyed being here with you all. And I wanted to say that this has been a very powerful reminder of the impact that stories have, both to change your internal landscape, but also how you view your place in the world and your external landscape. And so much of Ines, I very much admire the work you do, and I would love to hear the stories of your family. The words I've got written down here, I've written inclusion, connection, peace building, and unity, which have come across very strongly from today. But I have to say the phrase that will be ringing in my ears is "go to the story world." Thank you so much, Perry.
I love that too. And on that note, maybe Perry, would you like to contribute?
Oh, and thank you. First off, Saira, we should also all say thank you to you and the foundation for organizing with UNESCO this great event. And I'm so honored to be a part of it. Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you to all of you. You're wonderful. You've been wonderful.
But also, not only my inspiration today is the amount of time, as Ramsey was saying, that stories have been with us. Stories have been with us forever, and they carry us forward. And here I am, dressed in traditional clothing from my tribe, some deer skin on my legs and headdress here, and symbols of my family. And these are all important, and they help to tell that story of who I am and who we are as, in our language, Unguhunwe, human beings. And I think that is, with stories, really, we are human beings. And all of these stories across time, from where all of these panelists come from, I'm so inspired by that idea that we continue to share these stories now, moving forward, and they come from all time. And so, yes, let's go to the story world, and let's go together.
I love that, and absolutely, I love the idea, and I genuinely believe that maybe stories are what makes us human. The stories pop up everywhere. I don't know a culture that has no stories, and they would be a poor culture indeed. We've discovered so many things today. We've discovered that stories can take you places. They can help you find tolerance, kindness, empathy. They can entertain you. They can be companions. They can be friends. And by no means least, they can help you learn how to learn. They can be a sort of encapsulated experience. Stories go there in a way so that you don't necessarily need to. And I would love to, just as we end, take one more video that will take us into the story world, which is my sister Safia reading quite a humorous story of my father's collection. And once again, it's a fairly universal one. I've seen it in many, many countries. It's called The Horrible Dib Dib. And enjoy. Take stories with you wherever you go. Thank you.
The Horrible Dib-Dib by Idries Shah. One night, a thief, intending to rob an old woman, crept through the open window of her home and listened. Ah, the Dib-Dib, the horrible Dib-Dib. This abominable Dib-Dib will be the death of me. What on earth is this awful Dib-Dib? Wondered the thief. And could I have become infected? In fact, the more he thought about it, the surer the thief became that he had indeed caught the horrible illness of which she spoke. It wasn't long before he was shaking uncontrollably, only just managing to totter home. Seeing her husband in this enfeebled state, the thief's wife put him to bed, mopping his brow as he groaned. Oh, the sinister Dib-Dib! How can there be any doubt that the deadly Dib-Dib has got me in its grasp? When the thief saw the doctor, he was even more convinced that his final hours had come. The old woman at the end of the road has the accursed Dib-Dib, and it has flown from her to infect me. My son, said the doctor, your remaining hours may be few. Take this time to repent and pray for mercy. The doctor then hurried off to the woman's cottage, dreading the medical horrors he would find. Sure enough, he heard whimpering from within the dilapidated home. The doctor now began to feel as if an eerie chill had passed through him. He started to shake, and his hands clutched the window frame, causing it to rattle like the chattering of 1,000 teeth. At this alarming sound, the old woman leapt from her chair and seized the now terrified doctor by his quivering hands. What are you, a respectable man, doing leaning at people's windows at this time of night? Good but unfortunate woman, faltered the doctor. I heard you speak of the awful Dib-Dib, and now I feel that it has clutches upon my heart as well as upon your own. You incredible fool, screeched the old woman. You hear someone say Dib-Dib, and you instantly imagine that it's a lethal illness that is going to suck the last breath from your body? Look over there in the corner of the room, and you'll see the monstrous Dib-Dib as it really is. The doctor saw a rusty old tap, and listening as hard as his disease-ridden ears would allow, he heard it dripping with a relentless dip, dip, dip. Sheepishly, he left the house, having found that his life-threatening symptoms had vanished, and the old woman settled back down in her chair, muttering about the fools that surrounded her. Back at the thief's bedside, the medic made him promise never to steal again. After a great deal of research into your alarming case, I am prescribing this powerful medicine. But the second that you attempted to take what doesn't belong to you, the horrible Dib-Dib will immediately strike you down once again. Thanking the doctor profusely, the thief jumped up, instantly cured. I am happy to say that no matter how tempted he was, he never stole again, which meant that the horrible Dib-Dib never struck him down again, which left him in good enough health to begin a new career as a pharmacist. And the old woman went back to shouting at the dripping tap in the corner of her room, because although the doctor had offered to fix it, she had declined. Secretly, the doctor was pleased that the tap kept dripping, because it reminded him of how he too had been, ever so briefly, struck down by the horrible, horrible Dib-Dib.